Staff entrance is around the back. The words landed in the middle of the Sterling Vale Hotel lobby like a glass shattering across polished marble. Conversations faded. A few heads turned. The fountain near the grand staircase continued its quiet flow, but the atmosphere had changed. Richard Caldwell, the general manager of one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in Chicago, stood behind a front desk with his arms crossed and a smile that wasn't quite a smile. He was looking directly at a black woman standing alone beneath a crystal chandelier worth more than most cars in the parking garage. Naomi Whitaker didn't react. She didn't blink. She didn't argue. She simply stood there in a cream-colored blouse, black slacks, and comfortable flats, holding a slim leather portfolio at her side. No designer logos. No security team. No expensive jewelry announcing her status. To Richard, she looked like hotel staff. To everyone else watching, she looked like someone deciding whether a line had just been crossed. The lobby was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning. Business travelers rolled carry-on luggage across the polished floor. A family checked out near the concierge desk. A pair of investors sat in the lounge, sipping coffee beneath floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Every one of them had heard what Richard said. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward him. Calm, measured, almost curious. "Excuse me?" she asked. Richard gestured toward a side corridor without hesitation. Housekeeping and service personnel use the rear entrance. Guests come through the main doors. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Naomi looked around the lobby for a moment, taking in the gold accents, the towering floral arrangements, and the staff moving between guests. Then she returned her attention to Richard. "Interesting," she said softly. "Very interesting." Richard seemed encouraged by her calm tone. "If you're here for work, someone can direct you where you need to go." His voice carried farther this time. "We try to keep the guest experience exclusive." The word exclusive lingered in the air. Near the front desk, a young trainee named Grace Miller looked up from her computer. Something about the exchange felt wrong. She glanced toward Naomi, then toward Richard. Before she could speak, Richard's attention remained fixed on the woman he had already decided didn't belong. Naomi walked forward at an unhurried pace. Her footsteps echoed lightly across the marble floor. She stopped directly in front of the front desk. The lobby had become unusually quiet now. Even the investors in the lounge were watching. Richard straightened his tie. Naomi offered a polite smile. "I'd like to check in," she said. "I have a reservation." Richard's expression barely changed. "For yourself?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes." Richard let out a short laugh. Not loud, just enough. "I'm sure we'll figure out what's going on." And in that moment, standing beneath the chandelier, while dozens of strangers watched, Naomi Whitaker realized she was about to learn exactly how this hotel treated people when it thought nobody important was looking. Richard Caldwell reached toward the keyboard with the confidence of a man who believed the answer was already waiting for him. Naomi Whitaker calmly placed her leather portfolio on the counter and watched as he began typing. The glow from the monitor reflected across his face. For a few seconds, the only sound came from fingers tapping keys and the distant hum of conversation drifting through the lobby. Grace Miller tried not to stare, but curiosity pulled her eyes back to the screen again and again. Something about the woman standing at the counter felt different. It was not the way she dressed. It was not the way she spoke. It was the way she seemed completely unbothered by the tension surrounding her. Most guests would have argued by now. Some would have demanded a supervisor. Others would have walked away. Naomi did none of those things. She simply waited. Richard frowned at the monitor. Then he typed again. Naomi's reservation appeared exactly where it should have been. Bon tout de suite. Executive owner clearance. Priority access. The highest level designation available in the system. Richard stared at the information for a brief moment before minimizing the screen. Grace noticed. Her eyes widened. She had only worked at the hotel for 6 months, but she knew what those words meant. There were fewer than a dozen people in the entire company with that level of access. She opened her mouth to speak, but Richard shot her a look sharp enough to stop her immediately. Naomi noticed that too. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth before disappearing. "Did you find a reservation?" she asked politely. Richard leaned back. There appears to be some confusion. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Confusion? These types of bookings require additional verification. His voice grew louder as several guests continued watching. We cannot simply hand over a penthouse suite because someone claims it belongs to them. Naomi folded her hands in front of her. I never claimed it belonged to me. I said I reserved it. A businessman sitting near the lounge lowered his newspaper. An older woman waiting for transportation paused beside her luggage. The atmosphere felt different now. The room was paying attention. Richard forced a laugh. You have to understand. We receive all kinds of requests. Grace glanced at the screen again. The reservation was still there. Perfectly valid. Perfectly active. Nothing about it required additional verification. Her stomach tightened. Naomi remained calm. Then perhaps you should verify it properly. Richard ignored the suggestion. Instead, he looked Naomi up and down once more. Can you explain why someone with a reservation like this arrived alone? The question hung in the air. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Naomi answered immediately. Because I drove myself. The response drew a small chuckle from somewhere in the lobby. Richard's smile disappeared. Grace looked down at the keyboard. She knew exactly what was happening. The reservation was real. The guest was real. The problem had never been the booking. The problem was that Richard had already decided who Naomi was the moment she walked through the front doors. And every minute that passed made that decision harder for him to admit. Grace Miller could feel the tension spreading through the lobby like a storm gathering behind clear skies. She kept her eyes on the reservation screen, reading the same words again and again. Executive owner clearance. Priority access. There was no mistake. There was no system error. The woman standing at the front desk belonged there more than almost anyone else who walked through those doors. Yet Richard Caldwell continued acting as though he was uncovering some elaborate deception. Naomi Whitaker remained perfectly still. Her composure unsettled him more than anger ever could. Most people eventually became frustrated when they were treated unfairly. Naomi seemed almost patient, as if she were allowing something to unfold. Richard folded his arms. Let me ask you something, he said. Who arranged this reservation? Naomi answered immediately. The company. Richard smirked. That is a very convenient answer. A few guests exchanged looks. The older woman near the luggage stand slowly shook her head. Even she could tell the conversation was becoming less about policy and more about assumption. Naomi glanced toward the lobby windows where sunlight spilled across the marble floor. Then she looked back at Richard. You have the reservation in front of you, she said calmly. You verified it yourself. Richard's jaw tightened. Verification is more complicated than that. Grace knew that was not true. The reservation system had already done exactly what it was designed to do. There was nothing left to verify. Richard simply did not like the answer he had found. A bellman passing through the lobby slowed his pace. Two business travelers stopped near the concierge desk. Nobody wanted to appear nosy, yet nobody could stop watching. The exchange had become impossible to ignore. Richard leaned forward slightly. Penthouse guests usually arrive with assistants, drivers, or security. Naomi nodded. Some do. And you arrived alone. Yes. Richard spread his hands as though he had proven something important. Exactly. Naomi studied him for a moment. I'm not sure that means what you think it means. A few guests smiled. Richard did not. Grace could see frustration building beneath his polished exterior. The situation was moving beyond his control, and he knew it. Instead of admitting his mistake, he doubled down. Perhaps you should provide additional identification. Naomi reached into her portfolio and calmly placed a government-issued identification card on the counter. Richard barely glanced at it. Grace noticed. So did several people nearby. The problem was no longer hidden. The facts were sitting directly in front of him. He simply refused to accept them. Naomi slowly withdrew her hand. Anything else? She asked. Richard hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flashed across his face. Then his eyes drifted toward the small black access card attached to Naomi's reservation packet. The card displayed a discreet silver emblem recognized by every manager in the company. Grace immediately felt her stomach drop. She knew exactly what it represented. Richard knew too. Yet instead of acknowledging it, he reached toward the card and picked it up between two fingers. Naomi watched without blinking. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Whatever happened next was no longer about a reservation. It was about a choice. And Richard Caldwell was about to make the wrong one. Richard Caldwell turned the black access card over in his hand, as if examining evidence in a case he had already decided. The small silver emblem reflected the lobby lights. Every manager in the company knew that emblem. Every regional director knew it. Every executive assistant knew it. Yet Richard stared at it with deliberate indifference. Naomi Whitaker remained calm. Her expression never changed. Around them, the Sterling Vale lobby felt different now. The quiet luxury that usually defined the space had been replaced by something heavier. Curiosity, discomfort, anticipation. Guests were no longer pretending not to watch. A businessman near the lounge had completely abandoned his newspaper. Two women waiting for a rideshare stood beside their luggage with folded arms. Even employees moving through the lobby seemed to slow down as they passed. Grace Miller could barely believe what she was seeing. Richard knew exactly what the card represented. There was no possibility he had missed it, which meant he was making a choice. Naomi's voice broke the silence. "You should return that." Richard looked up. "Return what?" Naomi nodded toward the card. "The access credential you are holding." Richard gave a small laugh. "This?" He raised it slightly. "Until we determine who you are, I think it stays with us." Grace felt her stomach tighten. Naomi did not react. "You already know who I am," she said quietly. Richard leaned against the counter. "I know what your identification says." Naomi tilted her head. "And what does it say?" Richard did not answer. Instead, he gestured toward the lobby. "This hotel hosts professional athletes, Fortune 500 executives, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries." His voice carried farther than before. "We have standards to maintain." The words settled over the room. Nobody missed the implication. Naomi looked around the lobby for a moment. Her eyes moved across the marble floors, the chandeliers, the concierge desk, the guests watching from every direction. Then she returned her attention to Richard. "Standards are important," she agreed. "That is why this conversation matters." Richard smiled, as though he had won something. "I'm glad we agree." But Naomi's gaze never left him. "The difference is that we're talking about different standards." A faint murmur spread through the room. Grace lowered her eyes, trying not to smile. Richard's confidence began to crack around the edges. He could feel the room shifting. The problem was that Naomi refused to give him anything he could fight. No raised voice, no argument, no scene, just calm answers that made his behavior more visible with every passing second. He placed the card on the counter, but kept one hand over it. "Perhaps we should involve security." The lobby seemed to grow quieter still. Naomi simply nodded once. "That is your decision." Richard blinked. Most people became nervous when security was mentioned. Naomi sounded almost disappointed, as if she had hoped he would stop before reaching this point. Grace glanced back at the reservation screen. Executive owner clearance still glowed across the monitor. Unchanged, undeniable. The facts had never moved. Only Richard had. And with every step he took, he seemed to be walking deeper into a mistake he could no longer see. The mention of security changed something inside the lobby. Not because anyone felt threatened, but because it confirmed what many of the guests were already beginning to suspect. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was becoming a choice. Richard Caldwell reached for the desk phone with the confidence of a man who still believed authority would solve the problem authority had created. Naomi Whitaker watched quietly. She did not move. She did not object. She simply stood beneath the chandelier, while the entire room seemed to orbit around the decision unfolding in front of her. Grace Miller glanced between Richard and the reservation screen. Her pulse quickened. The words had not changed. Executive owner clearance. They remained fixed on the monitor like a warning nobody wanted to read aloud. Richard pressed a button. "I need security at the front desk," he said. "We have an individual refusing standard guest verification procedures." Several people exchanged looks immediately. The description did not match what they had witnessed. Naomi had provided identification. She had answered every question. She had remained calm throughout the entire encounter. Yet Richard's version sounded completely different. Across the lobby, a man seated near the coffee bar slowly lifted his phone. His name was Ethan Brooks, a travel content creator with hundreds of thousands of followers online. At first, he had simply been observing. Now he opened his camera application. Something about the situation felt important. Not dramatic. Important. He began recording. An older woman noticed him and quietly nodded. She seemed relieved that someone was documenting what everyone else had seen. Grace caught sight of the phone and felt her stomach tighten further. Richard did not notice. His attention remained fixed on Naomi. "You understand this is standard procedure," he said. Naomi met his eyes. "No," she replied. "It is not." The answer was calm, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Richard folded his arms. "Are you saying I do not know my own policies?" Naomi's expression remained unchanged. "I'm saying you stopped following them several minutes ago." A murmur moved through the lobby. Ethan adjusted his camera angle. Nearby guests leaned closer. Nobody interrupted. Nobody wanted to. The truth seemed to be revealing itself without assistance. Grace looked down at her keyboard and made a decision. Quietly, without drawing attention, she opened the full reservation profile. Additional details appeared. Corporate authorization, executive travel audit, ownership review access. Her eyes widened. This was not simply a high-level guest. Whoever Naomi Whitaker truly was, she ranked above nearly everyone in the organization. Grace looked up. Naomi's calm suddenly made perfect sense. Richard noticed Grace staring at the screen. "Close that window," he snapped. Grace hesitated. "Sir, I think there may be something you should see." Richard's face hardened instantly. "I said close it." The words echoed across the counter. Grace fell silent. Ethan's camera captured everything. Naomi observed the exchange carefully. For the first time, a faint look of disappointment crossed her face. Not anger, not frustration, disappointment, as though she had hoped someone would choose differently. Then the elevator doors opened. Two uniformed security officers stepped into the lobby and began walking toward the front desk. The room grew quieter than ever. Even the fountain seemed distant now. Richard straightened his tie. Naomi folded her hands calmly in front of her. And somewhere deep inside the Sterling Vale Hotel, the final minutes before everything changed had already begun. The two security officers approached with measured steps, their polished shoes gliding across the marble floor. Neither looked aggressive. Neither looked eager. They simply looked confused. They had responded to countless guest disputes over the years, but something about the scene waiting for them at the front desk felt different. Richard Caldwell immediately stepped forward as if reclaiming control. "Thank you for coming," he said. "This individual has refused verification requests and is disrupting normal operations." The officers exchanged a quick glance. One of them, a tall man named Marcus Reed, turned toward Naomi Whitaker. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" Naomi answered before Richard could interrupt. "There is a problem," she said calmly, "but not the one you were told about." The words settled over the lobby like a weight. Ethan Brooks continued recording from across the room. Several guests had quietly moved closer. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Marcus looked from Naomi to Richard and back again. Years of experience had taught him that the loudest version of a story was not always the most accurate. Richard pointed toward the entrance. "We simply need her removed from the guest area until we sort this out." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Removed from the guest area?" Richard nodded. "Correct. Interesting." Her voice remained even. "And where exactly would you like me to go?" Richard gestured toward the rear corridor. "Staff access is available through the service wing." The statement drew visible reactions from several people nearby. An older gentleman near the lounge slowly lowered his coffee cup. A woman waiting for transportation frowned openly. Grace Miller looked horrified. Richard seemed unaware of how every sentence was sounding to everyone except himself. Marcus shifted his weight. "Sir, can I ask what policy violation occurred?" Richard hesitated for the first time. Only briefly. Failure to satisfy guest verification requirements. Marcus frowned. "Has identification been provided?" Silence. Grace looked toward the counter. Naomi's identification was still sitting there. So was the reservation confirmation. So was the access credential. Every piece of information Richard claimed to be missing was already in front of him. Naomi watched the exchange quietly. She looked less like someone under scrutiny and more like someone conducting an evaluation. The realization made Grace uneasy. Richard finally answered, "That is not the point." Marcus looked unconvinced. Across the lobby, Ethan zoomed his camera slightly closer. The tension was no longer hidden beneath polite conversation. It was visible now. Naomi folded her hands. "You are making a decision you cannot reverse." Richard laughed, not because he found it funny, because he wanted the room to believe he was still in charge. People say things like that all the time. Naomi studied him carefully. "No," she said, "not like this." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Even Marcus seemed to pause. Richard's smile faded for a fraction of a second, just enough for the uncertainty underneath to show through. Grace looked back at the reservation profile one more time. Ownership review access, corporate authorization, executive clearance. Her heart began racing. Something told her the hotel was only minutes away from discovering exactly who Naomi Whitaker really was. And something else told her Richard Caldwell was running out of time to stop digging the hole he had created for himself. The lobby clock quietly marked another minute passing. To most people, it felt like time had slowed. To Naomi Whitaker, everything was moving exactly as expected. Marcus Reed looked toward Richard Caldwell once more. "Sir, before we go any further, I need clarification." Richard's patience finally began to crack. "The clarification is simple," he snapped. "She does not belong in restricted guest areas until verification is complete." Naomi watched him carefully. The disappointment in her eyes deepened. Not because he was questioning her, because he kept choosing the same answer every time he was given an opportunity to stop. Grace Miller swallowed hard. She could no longer remain silent. "Sir," she said cautiously, "the reservation profile is fully verified." The room froze. Richard turned toward her immediately. "Excuse me?" Grace's voice trembled slightly, but she continued. "The booking is active. The identification matches. The authorization codes are valid." Several guests exchanged glances. Ethan Brooks adjusted his camera and moved a little closer. Richard stared at Grace as though she had committed a betrayal. "You're speaking outside your responsibilities." Grace lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back at the screen. "I am reading what is in the system." Richard's jaw tightened. The truth was becoming harder to contain. Naomi remained silent. She did not help Grace. She did not defend herself. She simply allowed the facts to exist on their own. That was what made the situation so uncomfortable. Nobody could point to an outburst or a misunderstanding anymore. Everything was visible. Richard suddenly reached for the black access credential resting on the counter. "Fine," he said. "If there is no problem, then she will not mind waiting while we secure this." Before anyone could respond, he handed the credential to a nearby supervisor. "Place it in the management safe until this review is complete." Grace's face lost color. Marcus Reed frowned. Even Ethan lowered his camera for a second in disbelief. Naomi finally spoke. "You are confiscating it." Richard folded his arms. Temporarily, Naomi looked at the credential as it disappeared behind the front desk. For the first time, complete silence filled the lobby. No conversations, no footsteps, no phones ringing, nothing. Then she lifted her eyes back to Richard. That was a mistake. The words were not a threat. They sounded more like a conclusion. Richard laughed again, but this time the confidence was gone. The sound felt forced. "Everything is a mistake according to you." Naomi shook her head slightly. "No, not everything." Marcus Reed studied her expression. Something about her certainty felt impossible to ignore. This was not the confidence of someone hoping she was right. It was the certainty of someone who already knew the outcome. Across the lobby, a woman waiting for a ride quietly whispered to her husband, "Who is she?" He shook his head. "I do not know, but I think everyone here is about to find out." Grace looked at the reservation screen one final time. Her heart pounded. Hidden beneath the executive authorization codes was a notation she had somehow overlooked before. For simple words, Corporate ownership review visit. The moment she read them, her breath caught. Her eyes widened, and suddenly she understood exactly why Naomi Whitaker had remained calm from the very beginning. For a brief moment, the Sterling Vale lobby disappeared. The voices faded. The marble floors vanished. The chandeliers dissolved into memory. Naomi Whitaker found herself standing somewhere else entirely. She was 19 years old again, carrying a small suitcase through the lobby of a hotel in Boston. It had been her first business conference, her first chance to sit in rooms where decisions were made. She remembered approaching the front desk with excitement she could barely contain. She remembered the clerk looking past her 3 separate times before asking whether she was delivering luggage. She remembered the polite smile that was not really polite, the assumptions disguised as professionalism, the feeling of being evaluated before she had spoken a single word. Most of all, she remembered her mother calling that evening after hearing the disappointment in her voice. "Never waste your energy convincing people you belong," her mother had told her. "Build something so strong that one day they will have to answer to you." The memory remained with Naomi for more than 2 decades. Through every promotion, every board meeting, every acquisition, every late night spent building a company that eventually owned hotels across the country. The lesson was never about revenge. It was about dignity. Back in the present, the sounds of the lobby slowly returned. The fountain, the distant elevator chime, the quiet murmurs of guests watching history move 1 inch at a time. Naomi looked around the room. The same pattern, different faces, different city, same assumption. Richard Caldwell stood confidently behind the desk, unaware that the story he believed he was controlling had already slipped beyond his reach. Grace Miller remained frozen behind her computer screen. She had not taken her eyes off the reservation profile since discovering the notation hidden inside the corporate file. Corporate ownership review visit. For words that explained everything. Her pulse raced. She wanted to speak. She wanted to tell Richard what she had found. But something held her back. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the realization that he had already ignored every warning placed in front of him. Naomi's expression softened briefly, not with weakness, with understanding. She understood exactly what Grace was experiencing. Years earlier, she had stood in similar positions, watching authority choose comfort over truth, watching people stay silent because speaking carried consequences. Across the lobby, Ethan Brooks lowered his camera for a second. Even he could sense something shifting. The room felt different now. Not louder, heavier, as though everyone present had reached the same conclusion without saying it aloud. Richard continued speaking, explaining procedures nobody believed anymore. His words drifted through the air like echoes from a conversation that had already ended. Naomi barely listened. Her mother's voice remained stronger. "Build something so strong that one day they will have to answer to you." A faint smile touched her face, then disappeared. When she looked back at Richard, the disappointment was gone. In its place was certainty. Calm, unshakable certainty. Marcus Reed noticed the change immediately. So did Grace. So did several guests. They could not explain it, but they felt it. The evaluation was over. The waiting was almost finished. And somewhere beyond the walls of the hotel, forces Richard Caldwell had never imagined were already beginning to move. Naomi Whitaker slowly reached into her portfolio and removed her phone. The movement was simple, almost unremarkable, yet it drew the attention of everyone in the lobby. Richard Caldwell noticed it immediately. "Calling someone?" he asked with a smirk. Naomi looked at the screen for a moment before answering. "Yes." Richard spread his hands confidently. "Please do. Maybe they can explain why this reservation is causing so many problems." A few guests exchanged glances. Even Marcus Reed looked uncomfortable now. The facts had become impossible to ignore, yet Richard continued speaking as though he was still directing the conversation. Naomi pressed a single contact and lifted the phone to her ear. The call connected almost instantly. "Monica!" Her voice remained calm, professional, focused. On the other end, Monica Hayes responded without hesitation. "Good morning, Ms. Whitaker." Several people near the front desk exchanged curious looks. Naomi continued. Begins Sterling protocol. Silence followed. Not confusion. Not questions. Just immediate understanding. Monica's voice returned. Already in progress. Grace Miller felt a chill run through her. Richard frowned. The exchange had not sounded like a personal phone call. It sounded like a command. Naomi walked slowly toward one of the lobby seating areas and sat down with perfect composure. She crossed one leg over the other and looked around the room as though she were reviewing a meeting agenda. "Pull lobby footage beginning at my arrival," she said. Monica responded immediately. "Done." Naomi nodded once. "Freeze management override logs for the last 24 hours." "Done." "Preserve guest service recordings." "Already preserved." Richard's smile began to fade. He looked toward Marcus Reed. "This is ridiculous." But the words lacked conviction now. Across the lobby, Ethan Brooks continued recording. His followers were already commenting in real time. Something big was happening. Everyone could feel it. Naomi spoke again. "Verify who authorized confiscation of my credential." Monica paused for a moment. Keyboard sounds echoed faintly through the phone. Then her answer came. "Authorization entered by Richard Caldwell at 9:23 this morning." Several guests looked directly at Richard. His face tightened. Grace lowered her eyes. The room had begun turning against him. Not because Naomi was arguing. Because the facts were appearing one by one. Clean. Organized. Undeniable. Richard forced a laugh. "You expect people to believe this?" Naomi looked up from her chair. "Believe what? That you can just call someone and start ordering investigations?" Naomi studied him carefully. "You're still focused on the wrong question." The lobby fell silent again. Richard folded his arms. "Then what is the right question?" Naomi's expression never changed. "You should be asking why every request I make is being completed immediately." The answer landed like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus Reed glanced toward the front desk. Grace stared at the reservation profile. Ethan lowered his camera slightly. For the first time since the confrontation began, nobody seemed interested in Richard's explanation. They were all looking at Naomi. And somewhere inside the corporate systems of the company that owned the Sterling Vale, alerts were already spreading through executive channels. The review had begun. The records were being preserved. The decisions were being documented. And Richard Caldwell still had no idea that every step he had taken this morning was now being recorded by the very organization he believed he represented. Richard Caldwell stood motionless for a moment, tried to regain control of a situation that no longer seemed interested in listening to him. The lobby felt different now. The balance had shifted. Nobody could explain exactly what happened, but everyone could feel it. Guests who had once glanced casually toward the front desk were now openly watching. Employees exchanged nervous looks. Even the security officers remained where they were, no longer moving the situation forward. Naomi Whitaker sat calmly in the lounge chair, her phone resting in her hand. A soft chime sounded. An incoming message. She glanced at the screen. Monica Hayes had sent a single update. Executive review team connected. Naomi nodded slightly. Richard noticed. "Enough of these games," he said. "You keep acting as though you have some authority here." Naomi slowly stood. The movement alone seemed to quiet the room. She walked toward the front desk again. Every eye followed her. Grace Miller felt her pulse racing. She already knew the truth. The reservation file had made that impossible to deny. But hearing it spoken aloud would change everything. Richard folded his arms. "Who exactly do you think you are?" The question echoed through the lobby. For several seconds, nobody moved. Naomi looked directly at him. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just certainty. "That," she said softly, "is the first reasonable question you have asked all morning." Richard's expression hardened. Naomi glanced toward the guests surrounding the lobby. Toward Ethan Brooks and his camera. Toward Marcus Reed. Toward Grace. Then she returned her attention to Richard. "You told me to use the staff entrance." Silence. "You questioned my reservation." More silence. "You ignored verified identification." The room seemed frozen. "You confiscated a credential that never belonged to you." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Naomi continued. "And through all of it, you never once asked why my reservation carried executive clearance." Grace closed her eyes briefly. The moment had arrived. Naomi's phone suddenly illuminated again. Monica's voice came through the speaker, clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. MS. Whitaker, executive review has confirmed all records. We're standing by. Several guests exchanged startled looks. Richard stared at the phone, then back at Naomi. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty became visible on his face. Naomi nodded once. Thank you, Monica. She ended the call and slipped the phone into her portfolio. Then she looked directly at Richard Caldwell. My name is Naomi Whitaker. The lobby remained silent. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Whitaker Global Hospitality. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Naomi's voice remained steady. The Sterling Vale operates under my company's ownership. Ethan Brooks lowered his camera in disbelief. Grace covered her mouth. Marcus Reed stared at Richard. Across the lobby, a coffee cup slipped from someone's hand and landed harmlessly on a table with a soft clatter. Richard's face lost color. The confidence, the certainty, the authority he had relied on all morning vanished in an instant. Naomi held his gaze. You believe I was staff. Another beat of silence. The truth is much simpler. Richard stood frozen. Naomi's eyes never left his. You never saw a guest. You never saw a professional. You never saw a leader. You saw what you expected to see. The room remained perfectly still. Then she delivered the sentence nobody in the lobby would ever forget. You spent the last 9 minutes trying to remove the person who owns the company that signs your paycheck. For several long seconds, nobody in the Sterling Vale lobby seemed capable of speaking. The silence was not empty. It was stunned. Richard Caldwell stood frozen behind the front desk as the reality of what had just happened settled over him. The confidence that had carried him through the morning vanished completely. He looked toward Grace Miller as if hoping the reservation system might somehow tell a different story now. It did not. The screen remained unchanged. Executive clearance, ownership review, corporate authorization. The truth had been there the entire time. Grace slowly lifted her eyes from the monitor. Her voice was quiet but steady. She was in the system exactly as she said she was. Nobody challenged her. Nobody could. Ethan Brooks lowered his phone and stared at Naomi Whitaker with open disbelief. The comments flooding his live stream moved faster than he could read. Guests throughout the lobby exchanged whispers. Some shook their heads. Others simply watched Richard. The man who had spent the last several minutes acting as the final authority in the building suddenly looked very small, standing behind the same desk. Marcus Reed glanced toward Naomi and then back to Richard. The security officer did not need further explanation. The situation had become painfully clear. Naomi remained composed. She did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She simply stood there with the same calm presence she had carried since walking through the front doors. That seemed to affect the room more than any dramatic reaction could have. Richard finally found his voice. Ms. Whitaker, I think there has been a misunderstanding. Several guests visibly reacted to the statement. The words sounded hollow now. Naomi tilted her head slightly. A misunderstanding? Richard nodded quickly. Yes. Information was not communicated properly. Naomi studied him for a moment. You had my reservation. Richard swallowed. Yes. You had my identification. Yes. You had confirmation from your own employee. Grace lowered her eyes. Richard said nothing. Naomi continued. You had security present. Still no answer. You had every opportunity to stop. The words landed with quiet force. Across the lobby, someone began clapping. The sound was unexpected. A single pair of hands. Then another joined. And another. Within seconds, scattered applause moved through the room. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just honest. People were not applauding Naomi because she was powerful. They were applauding because they had watched her remain dignified while someone else repeatedly chose not to be. Grace felt emotion tighten in her throat. She had witnessed luxury travelers, celebrities, and executives pass through the hotel for years. Very few carried themselves the way Naomi Whitaker had. Monica Hayes called again. Naomi answered on speaker. Status update? Monica's voice was immediate. Executive review team has completed the preliminary assessment. Management access logs have been secured. Credential confiscation records have been confirmed. Legal and human resources representatives are now connected. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The room heard every word. There would be no rewriting what happened. No convenient explanation. No version of events shaped after the fact. The records existed. The witnesses existed. The footage existed. Naomi thanked Monica and ended the call. Then she looked around the lobby one final time. The atmosphere had changed completely. Guests who had watched in silence now stood openly beside the truth. Employees no longer avoided eye contact. And for the first time all morning, Richard Caldwell finally understood that the real consequences of his decisions had only just begun. The applause gradually faded, leaving behind a silence far more powerful than noise. Richard Caldwell stood behind the front desk, staring at the marble floor as though searching for a version of the morning that no longer existed. Around him, guests and employees remained still, unwilling to break the moment. Naomi Whitaker looked toward the front desk, where her confiscated credential had disappeared minutes earlier. "I would like my access credential returned," she said calmly. Nobody moved at first. Then, one of the supervisors hurried toward the management office. The same credential that had been treated as suspicious only moments earlier suddenly became the most important object in the building. Richard opened his mouth. "MS. Whitaker, if you would allow me to explain." Naomi turned toward him. "Explain what?" Richard hesitated. "The situation." Naomi nodded slightly. "The situation is already documented." His shoulders dropped. The answer was impossible to argue with. Monica Hayes called again. Naomi placed the call on speaker. "Monica, human resources and corporate compliance are ready, Ms. Whitaker." Every employee within earshot stiffened. Monica continued. "The preliminary findings confirm policy violations, misuse of managerial authority, improper confiscation of executive credentials, and failure to follow guest service protocols." Richard closed his eyes briefly. The words echoed through the lobby. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed clarification. The evidence had spoken for itself. Naomi listened quietly before responding. "Thank you. Please proceed." Monica paused. "Do you wish to issue immediate executive action?" Naomi looked around the room. Her gaze moved from the front desk to the guests, to Marcus Reed, to Ethan Brooks, and finally to Grace Miller. The young employee lowered her eyes, uncertain of what would happen next. Naomi spoke clearly. "Yes." The lobby seemed to hold its breath again. Effective immediately, Richard Caldwell is removed from his position as general manager pending final review and termination processing. The words landed with absolute finality. No raised voice. No anger. Just consequence. Monica answered instantly. "Confirmed." At that exact moment, Richard's management terminal emitted a soft notification tone. His login session ended automatically. Across the front desk, several system screens refreshed. Management privileges disappeared. Access rights were revoked. The change happened quietly, yet everyone saw it. The authority he had relied on all morning vanished in seconds. Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. Naomi continued. "Additionally, a complete review of guest complaint record from the past 12 months will begin today." Grace looked up sharply. Several employees exchanged nervous glances. Naomi's voice remained calm. "If this happened to me, it has happened to others." The statement settled heavily across the room. Nobody argued. Deep down, many already knew she was right. The supervisor returned, carrying the black credential with both hands. He offered it back respectfully. Naomi accepted it and placed it inside her portfolio. Then she looked directly at Richard. "You call me staff because you believe staff meant less important." Richard said nothing. "You assumed dignity came with a title, a suit, or permission from someone who looked different from me." The silence that followed felt endless. Naomi shook her head gently. "That was your mistake." Nobody applauded this time. Nobody spoke. The lesson carried more weight than any reaction could. The lobby stood perfectly still as accountability arrived, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. And for the first time that morning, The sterling veil felt like it belonged to the values it claimed to represent. The tension that had filled the sterling veil lobby all morning slowly gave way to something else. Reflection. Employees stood quietly behind the front desk. Guests gathered near the lounge no longer whispered among themselves. They simply watched. Naomi Whitaker looked around the room one final time, taking in every face. The chandeliers still glowed overhead. The fountains still flowed. The marble floors still reflected the morning light pouring through the windows. Yet the lobby felt entirely different from the place she had walked in less than 10 minutes earlier. Grace Miller stepped forward cautiously. "Ms. Whitaker," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Naomi turned toward her. Grace hesitated before speaking again. "I should have said something sooner." Naomi smiled gently. "You said something when it mattered." Grace lowered her eyes. The answer seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders. Around them, several employees looked visibly moved. They had witnessed more than a leadership decision that morning. They had witnessed a lesson. Naomi glanced toward Marcus Reed. The security officer gave a respectful nod. He understood now why every response from Naomi had been calm, measured, and deliberate. She had never needed to prove who she was. The truth had been proving itself the entire time. Ethan Brooks slowly lowered his phone. The recording was still running, but he no longer felt like he was documenting a confrontation. He felt like he was witnessing something people needed to remember. Not because of the termination, not because of the title, because of the dignity. Naomi walked toward the center of the lobby. Her voice carried naturally through the room. Luxury is not chandeliers. The guests listened. Luxury is not marble floors. Nobody moved. Luxury is not executive suites or expensive furniture. She paused briefly. Luxury is how people are treated when nobody believes they are important. The words settled over the room. Some employees looked down. Others nodded quietly. Naomi continued. Every guest deserves respect before they prove anything. Every person deserves dignity before they reveal a title. The silence that followed felt meaningful. Not uncomfortable. Meaningful. Monica Hayes sent one final message to Naomi's phone. Review completed. Naomi read it and slipped the phone away. Then she turned toward the elevators. Before leaving, she looked back at Grace one last time. Keep asking questions when something feels wrong. Grace nodded immediately. I will. Naomi smiled. Good. As the elevator doors opened, several guests began applauding once more. This time the sound spread through the entire lobby. Not because a powerful executive had won. Not because someone had lost a position. Because people recognized something larger than either of those things. Naomi stepped into the elevator without looking back. The doors began to close. Just before they did, she offered one final thought. Never confuse silence with weakness. Sometimes silence is simply confidence waiting for the truth to arrive. Then the doors closed. The lobby remained still for several seconds afterward. Nobody rushed to leave. Nobody returned immediately to their routines. They stood there thinking about what they had witnessed. A woman who had every reason to become angry chose composure. A woman who could have demanded respect simply revealed the truth. And in the end, the most important lesson had nothing to do with ownership, authority, or power. It was about seeing people clearly before deciding who they are. Because the moment Richard Caldwell stopped seeing a person and started seeing an assumption, he made the decision that changed everything. Naomi never needed a camera to prove what happened. She became the proof.